What is the significance of having census and even a reliable figure is significance to national planning?
Census is very critical for national development, because if you know your figures, a whole lot of things can happen. You are able to look at your demographics and you understand the spread across nation, then you know where to put your money. And this is very critical. And in terms of planning, and you know what takes priority, because the business of government is resource allocation. Now, you need to know where resources should be put by the government. In other words, a substantial share of the resources, where should government put it? And this can only come if you have a reliable data that tells you who is who, what age range is dominant, what are people income like, what a kind of housing gap you have find out. All these things will be encapsulated in your census figure, and then you put this on the table, the National Economic Planning, and of course, the Ministry of Finance will be able to sit down and allocate resources based on the demographics that your census show. But like you said, unfortunately, over the century, we have not been able to really have a reliable census figure. And I think the near perfect figure we had was the one that was taken by Beatrice in 1901. And of course, following the disruption of the First and Second World War, there were no census again until 1952, 1953. And the figure came out fairly still okay, with little disputation. But after the 1952-1953 census, we have not been able to really sit down to determine how many people really live in this part of the world. Because the 1962 census was fraught with a lot of irregularities, because even the British officer who supervised the counting in 1962 came out that there were no demographic basis for the increase in figure of the census compared to the 1953 census. So you have a situation where in 1953 you had about 31.6% a million people, and by 1963 or 62, the figure had risen to 55.2 million people. Now, in 1952, the northern region was having almost a 50% of the population. And by 1962 census, the figures skewed, with the easterner having about 70% rise, the westerner having 100% rise in their figure, and the north was a 0.5 rise. This was a big problem. And so accepting that figure was a nightmare. And Tafawa Balewa had to cancel that figure and order for another run. And when, of course, it was during 1963, of course, the people in the East refused to accept the figure. And, of course, from that time, we attempted in 1973, it didn't work out. And then, of course, 1991, Babangida tried to do one. And, of course, what is the real issue here? The real issue here was that at the table of negotiation in 1953, after the census in the London Conference, the North demanded that if we have half of the population, then we should have half of the representation. So out of the 149 members of the parliament that was just inaugurated by the 1951 Constitution, the Northerners demanded that they should have half of that representation, since their population speaks so. So it became a political tool. And this has been the real undoing in the inability of our country to actually arrive at a census figure that can be really reliable.
Okay, the last census was conducted in
2006.
Yes, and that's several years ago. Now, one census was built to hold in May this year, but that did not happen. We've seen that there have been delays, postponement after postponement in conducting another census due to several challenges. One of them is funding. And we also have challenges such as logistics. Let's look at funding, because that was a key issue when that census was announced to happen in May. The amount that was mentioned by the National Population Commission billed to have that census done alarmed a lot of Nigerians. You even had some Nigerians saying, let's count ourselves, don't bother, because this is too much.
That's
so
about
funding,
$1.8 billion.
why is it so expensive? And what can Nigeria do about funding? Because census has to happen after 2006. That's several years down the line, and census should have been done. How do we tackle the issue of funding, and why is it so expensive to have census done? I'm making reference now to the budget that was earmarked for conducting a census.
Yeah, you see, the issue of funding is directly also related to logistics, because you're having a whole lot of your nation, especially those who are in the wetland, where of course you will need to use boats to cross waters by the enumerators to be able to access these areas. Of course, this also poses a whole lot of cost and to the process and the exercise. Generally, and I think it's global, census is expensive. I try to do the arithmetic, just to do a base comparison between America and Nigeria, for example. The 2020 census in America cost them about $14 billion US. And if you put that to figure per their population of about 331 million people, you get that to be about $42 per person. And you can convert that to an exchange rate and know what that would be in Nigeria. That's about 32,000 naira per person. And when you compare our own figure, which was the total budget of about 869 billion that the Bureau asked for, and you put that to figure, that comes to about 4,226 naira per person to count. That's what we are looking at. So you see, but sometimes when we use this figure and say 800 billion, people just feel and say, what are they going to use 800 billion for? Now, understand that this 800 billion is to walk around the length and breadth of the 923,000 square kilometer landmass of Nigeria, both the riverine area and even the desert area. So this is where the challenge really lies. And you need enumerators who are going to do this, and of course they are going to be paid for doing this work of counting the household, counting the number of people. And this is why you see most of the countries don't do census every year. The convention is usually that is done every 10 years because of the volume that is attached to it. So most nations do their census every 10 years, and then of course use the percentage of increase to project for the years that are in between. So I think this is why it is quite expensive.
Now, looking at Nigeria, the first post-independence census was conducted in 1962. Have we learnt our lessons? Have we grown over the years? One will have expected that over the years we'll have been able to master this exercise. But talk to us about your impression about the lessons inherent with what happened in 1962, some of the irregularities, and then that led to irregular allocation of resources and funds. Have we learned our lessons?
It's difficult to learn. You see, the problem really here was that if you look at the 1952 census, because we have to always go back, because that's the foundation to the crisis. Now, a lot of people did not agree with the figure because they thought that people were undercounted. And the reason for this were very simple. Because at that time, people thought that the British were going to use the figure to impose tax on people. And so many people did not come out to be counted. Some people were hiding in the bush because they thought that the basis of this census was going to be for taxation. But yes, of course, the British had intention of knowing what revenue was coming to government so that they can do national planning. But the response of Nigeria was different. And you don't forget history. 1929, the About Women riots were about issues of taxation. And this is, in short, formed the basis of Chinua Achebe's work, Things Fall Apart. Where, of course, you see that Central was not able to hold because you will see tradition that was evolving into a modern one because of the new things that the white man and colonialism brought that were trying to undermine the tradition and the culture of the people. So these contradictions were there. And so many people, African people, really do not believe. But by the time they called to the London Conference in 1953, it became the basis for negotiation. So the political undertone to census was introduced at the London Conference. Because, of course, they don't say, oh, we were more than you. If we are more than you, we are half the population of Nigeria, then, of course, we demand half the representation for equity, proportionality. So this was what happened. And subsequently, the eyes of these other persons were opened. And by 1962, census came, figures were inflated according to Tafawa Balewa. That the West census grew by 100%, and the Eastern grew by 70%, because they were now also saying, okay, we need equity. Now our people are properly counted. So while we have a problem of undercounting in 1952, in 1962, it was a problem of overcounting. So this is the issue that, of course, we are still trying to grapple with. Don't forget that even in terms of the creation of, for example, local government, it's based on your census figure. And so it is the volume and the number of population that you have that will determine the number of local government that you have. Now, in terms of electioneering, the delimitations of constituency is also based on population. So that also determines the number of reps that will represent you at the center. Now, even in terms of resource allocation, it's also based on per head, the number of people that are coming from each region. And now, when we are struggling to have more local government, we are struggling to have more representation, we are struggling to have more revenue from the federation account, definitely this manipulation will always be there. And this has been the bane of the census crisis in Nigeria since independence.
Now let's look at the challenges with logistics. We have a system where the enumeration and even the demographic maps are inaccurate and some are even outdated. Let's even look at the urban cities. You're trying to locate a house in a particular street, and you look at the way the houses are enumerated, you're finding number 10 at the middle, you're finding number 50 at the beginning, and you're finding number maybe 70 somewhere, and so you just keep going along one particular street. You're trying to locate maybe number 15, and you're expecting that, okay, this is number 10, number 15 shouldn't be far away, but number 15 could be at the extreme end. So in remote settlements, how will the enumerators tackle this? How will they ensure that every house is counted, every person is counted, having a credible exercise?
I don't think the counting of houses is a problem when you speak in terms of logistics in this direction. You see, what the enumerators are trained to do is actually to go into the streets. When you enter into a house, you put a census marker on the house, that this house has been numbered. And of course, you have to progress from the beginning of a street to its ending. And then a number is attached to each house. And that number is recorded on the form that the enumerators will fill. That really would not pose a lot of problem.
What about the remote settlements getting
yes,
some
of course.
areas?
The same process will apply. No matter how scattered the houses are, of course, when you finish counting a house, you put a permanent marker on that house. The census number is put on the house. And anybody who is coming will know that this house has already been counted. So that really will not be the challenge. The real challenge in terms of logistics is especially in areas, of course, that are not, even in terms of our elections. You see this plays out from time to time, where, of course, you cannot deliver ballots to some certain areas because of access to those places. Where we have no road, there are some villages that, of course, motor cannot get to. It's either you have to drive a bicycle or you have to drive a motorbike to be able to go there. Or some places you have to use boat. Now, these are critical issues. And this, of course, create cost for the enumerators. So, it's either you have to buy your motorcycles, otherwise, which means if you have to move and they are going to count the area on a daily basis, they have to be paying transportation to go to that place. And this is added to the cost of enumeration. Now, even the allowances that are given to the enumerator, it also will increase because of the hazard allowance and the rest of it. So this is where logistics play a very critical role because of accessibility. We don't have roads. And this is where, of course, again, local governments have failed the entire nation because the things that they are supposed to be doing, creating earthen roads within their terrain that make movement very easy, have not been achieved in the last 63 years.
Talking about logistics from experience, do you think it would be more appropriate if government decides to outsource it or handle, government handles logistics itself? Because over the years, you've seen this mechanism playing out, the same story, the same scenario. And there's a saying that you can't keep doing the same thing over and over and expect different results. Do you think private entities should be brought in to handle the issue of logistics to take the burden off the federal government?
Oh, that's already been done. That's already been done. There's a whole lot of partnership that is going on even in terms of funding. And if you look at this one that was supposed to have held in May, over 291 billion had been disbursed already. And of course, all the enumerators have been trained. This is also part of the logistics. Because you need to train and detail those who are going to do the enumeration. Now, even the delimitation of the space has to be done so that you can map the places out where this enumeration had to happen. All these pre-census issues had actually been accomplished. Now, the real big challenge is now to go actually to do the proper and actual counting. Now, but for me, really, it's not even the private sector. If we can really handle the issue of trust in our environment, for example, which is the real basis, local government could actually do these things effortlessly over a period of a year or two without necessarily having to invest this massive resource. Just the same way the issue of immunization is handled by the local government. You see the local government staff moving from house to house for the purpose of immunization. We can actually have census offices in the local government. But the challenge is, will the figures be reliable? Now there's a politics that is attached to the figures. So this is where really the challenge is for us as a nation, where we really cannot trust public officers to do things and do it from their heart without hidden intentions and motives.
So when the census eventually happens, for elections, there are restrictions of movement. Would there be need? But there's an argument that since it's census and just counting, for restriction of movement, maybe the claim that day and no work day for people to be home for the counting to happen. Will all of that be necessary to happen? And for how long do we need to do that? A day, 2 days?
Yeah, this is again, it also speaks to the real issues of who we are as a people. I don't think we need to really stop business because we want to count people. We should not. And I think maybe when you look at what people are doing real elsewhere, we can even actually make it simpler and easier by having census table in words. where people can voluntarily come and register themselves. So you have an enumerator who sits down, just the way we register voters. And we create those constituencies, use the same constituency. And people sit down, the people in the locality, they will come and register themselves. And you set the time frame for registration, maybe 1 week, 2 weeks. That makes it a lot cheaper. All that you will just need to do is to have, at the end of the day, people who back check the figure. What that means is that you have to hire maybe an agency who will just take some sample of the forms filled by this individual and go to sample to see if those figures tally with what is on the ground. This is done in quantitative research. So when we send field workers out, they do their feed. We also recruit an agency to go and do back check to be sure that the figures are right. And I think this is one arrangement that can be done and will really reduce the logistics challenge that you speak about.
You know, let's make reference to the last attempt towards conducting census in Nigeria. The minister was quoted as asking for support in cash and kind from Nigerians. Do you think there's a need for Nigerians, to be part of funding for census or to donate money? Does that sound professional or universal?
Well, I think it really won't be a bad idea. And this is one issue that we cannot talk about too much. The role and the place of volunteerism, especially when you look at a nation that is so poor, even though there is so much resource that nature has given to us, there are still potentials. So we cannot use them to buy chewing gum at the moment. Now, the real issue is that I don't think maybe it should be cash. It can actually be volunteers. People who can volunteer to help in the enumeration within their localities. And I think it's actually relying on this kind of support will help drag down the cost for census. But I don't think it's immoral if rich people who cannot volunteer can support those who are doing it. You know, this happened even during the electioneering, where you have parties coming and seeing people who are doing registration. They help them with canopy setup. They help them with generator to power their equipment. Some people bring lunch for the people who are doing the registration and all of that. People do that and they volunteer. And I don't think it's out of place if nationals can actually come out to see. Because we have a nation, and this has been my argument. If we speak as we're talking right now, that over 92% of our revenue is expended on servicing debt, it will be immoral to continue to ask government to borrow. So whatever private individuals and citizens can do to actually complement the effort of government in this direction, for me, it will be a welcome development.
Okay, let's look at the need for having a census done. We have data collected at different levels. When people want to open a bank account, they need to do biometric for BVN, and then we have the national identity card, national identity number. Can this put together, synergizing this data, achieve the same results as having a census would to reduce costs?
Well, I think it will to a very large extent, but it cannot completely give you the accuracy of data. So whether we like it or not, we will still have to do census. And that's why you see, even in the most advanced of economies, they are still doing census. But they do it every 10 years. Not to say that their national identity program is not working. You see, because if you have a database, for example, where deaths are not properly recorded, for example, and births are not properly recorded, and access is still denied, it will be very difficult for you to capture actual figures. Especially when you look at our environment like Nigeria. So you see, some people just die and they just go, but they have a national ID card. Now, you still will capture that in your data as if the person is alive. So, because the national ID card has no means of knowing whether somebody is dead or not dead. But that said, there's a whole need for us to actually integrate our data. And this is very, very important. I remember the last time I was having a class and I was saying to them that, look, even with the BVN, as foolproof as it is, that some people are still beating it. Because you can register BVN here and then you go and capture another NIN. At the point of thumb printing, the system should be able to tell the network that, look, this person has been captured differently elsewhere. But I've seen situations where people who have BVN, they have NIN number, but they have different names on the BVN and on the NIN. This is a problem. So this speaks to our ability to integrate and sync all our data that we are collecting. Because if, for example, the national ID card is working, we don't need any voter registration. Because actually save us money. All the eligible voters just go to the pool with their national ID card and not voter's card. Because that tells your age, that tells where you live. So if you come to the polling unit, the person there will be able to determine whether you are supposed to vote here or not to vote here. So these are issues that we can actually resolve and save costs in other areas. But unfortunately, you go to road safety, you capture data. You go to immigration, you capture data. You go to the banks, you capture data. And I don't think this is very healthy. If, of course, I have a bank account, I want to open a bank account, and I have a national ID card, the bank should find a way to actually call up my data by a code that gives who I am, whether my facial identification, everything that concerns me should just come at once. And then we will save ourselves a whole lot of money. But whether we have a foolproof national identification, my point is that we will still need to do census to get to a near accurate figure for the purpose of planning.
All right, as we wrap up, let's talk about the need for transparency and accountability. You know, how do we ensure that the money that has been budgeted or released are used for intended purpose? You know, they're talking about transparency here. And then what do you think can be done to improve the processes or the exercise of census in Nigeria?
It is important that we emphasize these issues of transparency and accountability. There are people that are giving money and they are able to spend the money well and bring it back. I just mentioned the American Bureau for Statistics just now. Their 2020 census, the projection was about 15.4 billion US dollars. But the actual money spent is about 14 billion. That's accountability. That is not that once we say, oh, census is going to cost 890, which is actually budget. And it's either we finish the entire money or we are asking for more money because it has not gone around. And this is because a whole lot happens where people don't have values. And that's why we will continue to speak to the value system of our people. Because if we all have values and we will do things well, and we understand that the whole money belongs to all of us, it's our commonwealth, and we have to all protect it so that our children can have good life, the issue of transparency becomes very, very good. But people must know that there's a life also beyond elections. So census is not just for election purpose. Even in terms of private sector planning, their manufacturing is also critical, because you really need to know your market and your audience and know where they live. So I think that all this sensitization we need to do, that people know that census is not about political representation. there are other factors that are critical to the use of census. We know our demography. We know the number of children. We know the number who are out of school. We know the home gap, the home gap or the homelessness gap in the country. All these things, how government determine where infrastructure should be, the number of people that can access it, all these are critical. And these, for me, are far outweigh political representation, which of course are precondition the falsification of census data in Nigeria in the past 6 decades.
Let's start with your own assessment of the level of public awareness and participation when it comes to census activity in Nigeria.
Well, I think in terms of public awareness, it's also correlated to the level of literacy that is in society. You live in a society where a lot of people are terribly illiterate, and it's difficult really to understand some basic issues. And that's why it's easy for political actors to hijack the systems and manipulate the way people perceive some certain things. You see, this looks funny. I was looking at one short video the other day, and when people were doing these mobile protests, and then they were asking somebody, why are you wearing black? He said, is that Mobile now that died? He said, who is Mobile? He said, one Calabar boy that was working for his master, and then, you know, the master killed him. And so, see, this is the level of literacy in the environment that people really don't have full picture, because we have weaponized illiteracy and access to education in Nigeria. And so this is very critical. And this is what people are doing. So you go to a community to tell them and say, you see, this thing that is coming, you see, the more we are, the more we can get money from government. And then, of course, they are prone to manipulation and the rest of it. So I think we need to really, like Sama said earlier, see how we can engage very relevant stakeholders to speak to some of these national issues. We need the churches and the mosque to educate and enlighten its members on the significance and the importance of national data as it relates to planning and efficient and effective use and allocation of resources. So we need to do more. Yes, of course, we can talk about National Orientation Agency, but we also know the limit to which these people can get to. Not everybody have access to radio, not everybody have access to television, and even in some places where people have access to television, of course, there must also be language constraint and barrier that these have to be translated into several and multi-ethnic languages because of the way Nigerian is structured. Now, this is a big challenge that the nation faces. So I think it's actually better to engage with stakeholders, traditional rulers who are very close to the community, themselves being first enlightened, so that, of course, again, they don't carry misperception to the community. That this thing is beyond just resource allocation, it's beyond political representation, like I said earlier. It's just about us having a clear data of who we are, where we live, and so that, of course, even those who are going to intervene, development agencies and the rest of them, can actually take this data, even for research purposes, for sociologists, psychologists, to be able to look at our data and be able to really plan and also project theories that can explain some of our behavior. This is important. So we must take it beyond politics and get to the grassroots to let people really understand the relevance so that they themselves can come out. You know, I spoke earlier on about the way people saw it, pre-independence, as only a means for taxation. And so when government says they want to do enumeration, what comes to the mind of the average man is that they want to collect taxes. So we must also let them understand that it is beyond tax collection. There are so much that come with accurate data for nation. Like they say today, data is life.
Okay, before we move into detail, we've talked about misconceptions. Where the misconceptions are not corrected or are unable to be corrected, what are the likely effects?
Yeah, this is what it is. If you tell people something that is wrong, of course their decisions will be based on the information they have. It's simple. And I can tell you that decisions cannot be right. You know, like they say in computer system, it's garbage in, garbage out. So it's the information that people have that will determine the outcome and the quality of their decisions. Now, if people have very poor information, then of course be sure that the decision that's going to be taken is going to be very poor. So if we don't want poor decision in terms of participation, in terms of supporting the credibility and the transparency of the system, then of course we must put in their domain the complete and adequate information that will enable them to actually judge and see census as a tool for national development rather than a punitive or a rewarding tool.
There seems to be this, large distrust between the people and the government in a situation whereby government comes up with a policy or any directive. There's always this distrust from the angle of the citizens. Now, let's bring this to census. Taking, for instance, an announcement is being made now, there's going to be census next week, next month. This will also spring up. How do we correct the narrative whereby virtually every interaction between the citizens and the government is laced with distrust?
Well, I think, again, it's really more about how government communicates itself. That's critically important here. You see, there's something they say in my village. If somebody who is known to say the truth often lies against you, it's difficult for you to really get out of it, because everybody is going to see it as true. Now, if somebody who is also reputed for lying tells the truth, it will be very difficult for people to believe. Because, of course, it's known to be saying the truth. People will not wait for it to happen before they will accept the truth. And I think this is where government communication becomes very fundamental. And for me, it's also very important, even especially for this regime. Because so far so good, we are seeing some retractions, which is not good, and they are too early. Because this creates a whole lot of disbelief. If you say something today and tomorrow you are trying to correct it and you are manipulating it, it will be difficult for people to believe you. So this is where, for us, when we are going to communicate, like they say, if you are going to equity, your hands must be very clean. Let's tell people things the way they are. And once people can see that government is talking and they are meaning what they say and they are saying what they mean, then of course the level of trust in the system can increase. But where you see aids to government, rush to the press, give misinformation, this creates room for support stress in a political system. And I think this is where we need to really train those who speak for government to know how to engage with their stakeholders. It's very important. This is very, very important. And you can imagine that you are coming to tell people this is what it is, and what they are saying is different from what you have said. So I think we need to build trust in the system. Government needs to communicate the things the way they are. Let people know. Don't give people false hope. You know, some people want to see themselves to see, oh, we are doing well, I'm active. Yes, your work will speak for you. So this is the issue. Where you see, I keep emphasizing this fact, you over-promise and under-deliver. So people should be able to learn to say things the way they are. And I think this is where public officers need to really be cautious in dealing with people. Because people just look a record to history and say, well, yesterday he said a lie. Today he said another lie. So when he's going to say something tomorrow, it's going to be likely another lie. And this is why you see people cannot even believe even the very good policy government pursues, because when people come to the public and tell you one thing, so this is the issue. It should be intentional with the government. You can imagine as the last regime was going and we say, oh, Nigerian air has been born. After a long while, some of us were so happy. And weeks after, we are still talking about the agreement between Ethiopia and Nigerian airline is still being stalled. So these are issues, and this creates a whole lot of distrust between government and its citizens. And I think if government comes open to the air and tell people what it is, citizens are likely to believe. I'll give you one example from India. You see, when Indians were going to remove their subsidy, they took a very fundamental step. And they went to their citizens and said, this is the position of government. This is what we can do. If we continue with this subsidy, this is what you will get. If you remove it, this is what you are going to likely get. But before they got to that point, they had concluded their national identification program, which of course cost India about $1 billion US to number about 1.3 billion people in India. And every Indian had that card. So they were able to isolate the really poor people in society and know where they were. And they came at a figure of about 300 million people who were really poor Indians. And what government decided to do was to say, well, this very poor Indian who had no access to bank account and these things, government was going to create bank account for them based on the data captured. So those bank accounts were created. And government promised the people that what government was spending monthly to fund citizen subsidy, in order to create efficiency in that system, the excess of the subsidized product will be paid by government directly to these very poor people's accounts. And so as money started to hit the poor people account, the new government was serious about the business. And so all the people that had been taking advantage of the poor people to perpetuate the subsidy regime in India had no excuse, because the people were directly getting money and allowed from government. So they could not really use them as an excuse. And then, of course, Indians were able to phase out subsidy in their energy distribution. But today, look at it. India is supplying electricity to about 4 of its neighbors. And they are making huge revenue from it. And I think the cleaning of the system is vital and important for us. And when government is speaking to issues and the citizens are told exactly the situation and the position without raising hope unnecessarily, people will begin to adjust and know that this person means what he's saying, and then, of course, they will deal with him based on facts.
All right, let's come to the issue of data, using data to plan. At the moment, Nigeria still uses the data from the 2006 census to plan, and estimations given most times by the World Bank. So what is the effect of planning with an outdated data?
Well, I think, yeah, like what every other nation do is you do a census and you look at the average between the last you did and the one you did. You can be able to estimate the percentage of increase. So what we have done in the last 17 years is actually to use at the figure of 2006 to estimate and project what our population likely going to be, using the average of between 2.5% increase and 3.3% increase, depending on the factors that you are looking at. So that's why you have various degree of census. So some people say it's 116, some people say 1110, depending on what percentage increase you're likely to use. Now, what this means is that you don't know your actuals. So everything is based on estimation. So in terms of the allocation of resources, you will not be able to really determine where to put your money. For example, you may think that the biggest challenge you have is out of school children. And then you are channeling the whole of your resources to deal with the problem of out of school children. Whereas in terms of demographic, what you really have as a problem is aging. You see? So you see, you will be moving resource to the wrong direction. So this is why it is important to have data that are near accurate. Of course, you may not be able to have exactly accurate data, but at least you have something that is closer to accurate. And then, of course, on the basis of this, you will be able to say for certainty what number of men we have, what number of women are in this society, what number of boys we have who are under 18, who are under 15. So we will be able to plan for this various segment. Where do they live? Are they in the urban area? Are they in the rural sector? So that spatial distribution, you are able to also account for it. So that if you are moving primary health care to the rural area, and you are building more in the rural area, whereas the people have since moved to the urban center, the resource you have deployed to the rural will be wasted. I keep using the example of, for example, secondary school in my village. When we were there those days, we had a class A to F in morning section, and you have F to I in evening session. School was full. Each class, a minimum of 45 people in the class. So you can estimate what number it is. But that whole school today is not up to 100 people going there. So when you look at it, you see in that kind of environment, this village has a secondary school. They have 3 teachers. They have 100 people. This village have 20 people, 2 teachers. Waste of resource. So if you know where your people are, know the number of children that are in that place, you can sit down at the education board, for example, and determine whether to manage resources to get better results than focus on community as it were with over-bloated figure. And then you are putting wrong resource at the wrong place.
Let's focus on the root of the problem. Let's look critically. What are the factors responsible for this inability to conduct census over the years? We had one in 1962, and one will expect that, there's a need to build on that, or will have built on that over the years. Talk to us about some of these challenges and these difficulties.
I think it's really not a challenge for me as a person, just my perspective and view. And I take the line of reasoning of late Professor Claude Ake, God bless his soul, who spoke about the politicization of everything in Nigeria. And I think the real problem is that the politics in Nigeria has been over-politicized. Development in Nigeria, had been over-politicized over the years. This is the real basic issues. Other issue, costs associated, talk about personnel, all these are just, ancillary issues or secondary issues. The real critical challenge here is the fact that everybody who gets in on the top is only thinking about what they are going to use the data for. And the whole idea is because of what you call politics. You remember, even in that 2006, when we're talking about national identification, why census was going on, to use them pari passu, some very big powers then were asking fundamental question. What will the data be used for? Are they going to use it for election? And once, of course, the answer came that, look, if we have right census and we have good identification system, we can actually use it for election. Politicians bungled the process. And that's why up to date, we cannot even conduct census. We cannot do proper identification of our citizens. Whereas elsewhere, these things are within the beck and call of anybody. If a child is born in the UAE today, that child has a national ID card. Same is true for America. Because these are already within the facilities. So you don't really need to be going around every year to update this data. But unfortunately, we have not been able to synchronize this. You can imagine that if a child is born today in Nigeria, and of course, National Identification Scheme captures it, automatically it's updated at the census data bank. Automatic. So we will have very, very near accurate data. But unfortunately, because of some of these considerations, the agencies working themselves in silos, where chief executives of certain parastatal agencies have become a mini god, so to speak, and pursuing their own parochial vision and goal at cross purposes with the real essence of the business of government, which is the welfare of citizens, you will find that it will be difficult for you to really get at data that can be meaningful and realistic.
Now, in gathering data that will be meaningful and realistic, the NPC talked about using technology, digitalizing the process. What kind of technology will be needed to have a credible and meaningful data in Nigeria?
Well, I think NPC had tried really to see how to really modernize the collection of data, especially in the one that we're expecting to happen anytime soon. They produced their own part, for example, that will enhance the capture of this data. Of course, biometrics is being introduced. Facial recognition technology is being reintroduced. And this is to ensure that, of course, every data that is captured is authentic. Now, of course, because you know that the biometric system can only accept your thumbprint once, and that automatically will weed out, you know, people that are not captured. But the real big question here is the fact that, of course, also again, look at the access that we'll have to electricity, access to internet, and all of that thing. How are we going to be able to grapple with the challenge of really capturing people at the rural area? And here, of course, you see, they're also proposing a hybrid between real-time digital data and some manual form. And this is where the problem always comes in. We see this happen in our elections. And this is why people are asking. INEC promises us so much during the election, but this hybrid system bungled the entire system. So this is the challenge that NPC will likely face. But I think that for the purpose of accountability and transparency, it will be proper that after the whole exercise, they need to actually do a forensic audit on the data itself is necessary, so that an independent body will be able to take the entire data and clean it out to be sure that every information that is in that system corresponds with both facial data, biometric data, and of course the physical structure data that is captured by the enumerators. So this is important. Then of course the use of GIS, spatial technology, satellite images, to be able to actually see, if you say you have gone to a particular region and you saw 20 houses in that place, of course we can correspond that with satellite images to be sure that those 20 houses were actually there. So all these things can actually be used to validate and make sure that data that is actually collected are near accurate.
As a follow-up to our earlier discussion, you know, census data over the years have shown that, you know, Nigeria has been experiencing population growth. Most importantly, you see that more people reside in the urban areas according to this data and the survey. Talk to us about the impact of this on national planning and development.
Well, I think it's a real big problem as we speak. It's just that somehow, maybe because we have not had real hard fact or data to this extent, a lot of people really don't know the significance of what we're talking about. Now, when you compare to the 1980s, 1970s, you find that the population living in the urban center were about 15% compared to what you have today, where almost about 65% of our population, according to some data, actually live in the urban center. Now, what this portends for the nation is that there's a stress put on the facilities that are put on the urban centers. And because of the overpopulation in the urban center, so the struggle for amenities, infrastructure, is a huge problem. And you have with attendant waste challenge and management that comes with urban centers. And I think this is a big challenge. And I think that you really need to be able to harvest the real hard data, so we really know the number of people who are living in the urban center and see what incentives that can be created in the rural area so that they can be some backward integrations into the rural area. People moving from the urban centers and then coming to the rural area. This is important because if you see some of the facilities you have in the rural area, I just mentioned the schools, for example, in my own local government, it's almost a waste. But whereas when you come to the urban center, you're seeing overpopulation. So I think that a whole lot of attention should focus on the rural area so that people can begin to reintegrate or go back to the rural communities and have better life and good life than the choked kind of life that you see in the urban center today.
Now, after data is collected during census exercise, utilization of the data is another challenge. How do we ensure that the data collected is well utilized, and to what sectors do we need to begin to utilize these data for planning?
You know, you have a situation where it's almost peculiar, you know, around this climb, where you have a situation where certain things are in place, but when it comes to the implementation, it becomes a challenge. And I think it's still the same issue. So let's allow Idauza to react.
It's not enough to have the new numbers.
Yeah.
Now, if we have the new numbers, how do we begin to use that to plan? And what sectors would need to begin to utilize that data?
You see, I think this is where, of course, the innovation that MPC is being introduced to the current census will be real of great advantage, because we're going to have a real-time data analysis on the dashboard. That a mere look at the dashboard alone, you will be able to see where the data are in terms of their demographic spread and configurations. So this will help. The one you did before, which are manual, of course, you know issues with data loss. Trying to manually collate this thing become really very difficult. Now, with this technology introduced, you are able to actually accurately capture the data real time. And if this is actually done well, as the enumeration is going on, you can actually go on the website of MPC and you will be able to see what is the data in your area by age classification, by social class, by gender, and all the other demographic indicators. You will be able to see it real life, and that helps you to begin to think. For example, you know the number of people who are graduating in your area. You know the number of people who have just secondary education. So that if you're going to be planning, you know, is it more tertiary education you need, or more secondary education you need, or more primary education you need? All these things will happen. Now you see there's a whole lot of massive push on girl child education. The data will show it. Whether there's actually a disparity between the girl child education and the boy child education. So it will help the nation to know where to focus on and put the conversation on. And so people who want to actually run NGO, you may discover that there may be more boys out of school than girls out of school. And therefore, new NGOs begin to cater for those numbers. This is where accurate data become a life for every nation. So if we have it, it will help us to be able to plan our resources. Look at it. Access to health, for example. You see the last Nigerian Bureau for Statistics report that shows that over 133 million are dimensionally poor. Now, if you look at the indicators that are used, is to say, oh, how many people have access to school, have access to education, have access to good health system. All these things came together to what, of course, MBS said is dimensional poverty. Now, you will be able to see really in real time how many people are dimensionally poor in terms of health, access to good road, access to good public water, access to electricity, access to healthcare systems. So we will know where they are. And then, of course, government can begin to focus in areas where there are gaps. And of course, this will no longer spur controversy because numbers will not lie. It will no longer be seen as if a government is deliberately favoring one ethnic group to the other. Because everybody can see the national data and really see where there are problems that needs government interventions. And once you can determine where these problems are that needs national intervention, now you will be able to explain resource allocation without suspicion.
There's this projection that come year 2050, the population of Nigeria might likely increase to 450 million. What kind of preparation is needed to be able to manage this kind of, if I may use the word, population explosion? What kind of data research, what kind of analysis, what kind of preparation will be needed in order to be able to manage this consistent sign of growth?
Well, I think a whole lot is needed in this area. You know, my professor at the University of Lagos those days, when he was talking to us about international economists, used to say to us that in 1974, when he has his fourth child, that the population of Nigeria was already too much because our economy or our GDP really could not support 4 people in a family as far as 1974. Now you can imagine what the figures are as we speak. And you see, that was the situation in which China was some years ago, that they had to deliberately formulate population control mechanism. Of course, it has its positive, it also has its negative, because as we speak now, China is one of the countries in the world whose population is going down rather than going up. And that's why you see India has overtaken China in terms of the size of population. So they're having to deal with problem with aging now. Now they are trying to motivate young people to start to marry and have children. And of course, that will take a whole lot of time to change. So these are the things you see. If you see that your GDP is growing at an arithmetic progression and your population is growing at a geometric proportion, now there's a disincentive here, because your GDP will not be able to accommodate or take care of your population that is growing faster. And this is the problem that Nigeria really faces. Now, in terms of even land access, it will become a more problem. The last time we were speaking about, urban migration. You talk about a lot of people who are moving away from the north as a result of desertification, trying to come into the southern belts of Nigeria, and that is creating a whole lot of tension, which of course we call the farmer header crisis. Now this migration pattern will continue, because when people don't have access to land or livable land, what do they will be looking for where to get into to get land, and that will bring original communities in conflict with migrants, which likely is going to take us back to the Stone Ages, where there were intertribal wars. Now, in order to avoid this kind of a trend, and I think national planners need to begin to see how we can prepare for this eventuality that is real going to happen. For me, is a time bomb. The way we use land today has to change. The way we practice agriculture today has to change. Rather than grow horizontally, Nigeria must deliberately grow vertically. Because that's the only way to go. And that is the only way to make provision for over 230 million people that will be born between now and then.
Okay, let's take a step back to technology. Now, when data has been collected using different technological means, biometrics and all, one thing that people sometimes worry is the privacy and the security of this data. Now, how do we ensure, not just for census purpose, but we know that at different points data has been captured. How do we ensure the privacy of the data collected and the security of it as well?
And I think this is where, for example, the use of technology is also a plus, because the system is encrypted, and because it's encrypted, real third party can't see those data, except those who have the right and access to the database. So data security will be guaranteed, really, because you are seeing it, you just put in your thing, and it's encrypted at the other end. The data is plugged in. Even the enumerator cannot carry all the data in his head. So the system is the one that is banking. It's only people who have access to the data bank that can compromise that system. And I think a lot will need to be done in that regard, so that those who manage our critical national assets, including data, do not compromise it. Do not give it out to people who don't need it or who may use it for vicious purpose, but that the right people who need to have access to this data for the purpose of planning are the ones that have clear access to it.
My question has two legs. The first one is part of the reason for having census data is to facilitate national planning and allocation of resources. Now, with what we have now, it shows the allocation of resources is defective with the survey data from the present, census figures and the statistics we've had over the years. The second leg to it is, will you advise that the federal government should embark on another exercise, soonest, maybe in the next 1 year, looking at the present economic realities vis-a-vis the fact that it's also important for economic planning and allocation of resources?
Well, I think at this point in our national life, we need to do a baseline census that can serve us in the next 10 years, in the next 20 years. It's important. It is good that we capture our data rightly.
In spite of the economic realities?
Oh, yes, it is important.
Okay.
It is important because, you see, it's foundational to national development. Let us really know for the first time how many numbers that we are. Let's know where we live. Let's be able to estimate, as it were, our infrastructure deficit. You see, because there's a correlate between the figures we're currently using and the authenticity of the figures that is generating those numbers. Now, if you don't do this right, you cannot plan well. Even where people are having agitation, it's going to solve a lot of problems for us as a nation in terms of reallocation of basic national infrastructure, in terms of constructing new infrastructure to actually see if I'm going to put something here, do we really, is it economically viable? Even in setting of economic activities, it will help even people who are making products as private sector to be able to distribute efficiently. We know the number of people who are driving cars, for example, in the rural area, and we can determine the quantum of petrol, for example, that is consumed, or kerosene that is used in those areas. These are fundamentals, and this is why this regime must prioritize this census. And once we can capture it right, a lot of things will go right, even including our elections.
Talking about things going right, and you just mentioned election. Now, one of the reasons people try to influence the data that they submit or data collected during census is because of the allocation of economic resources and development that may come to their region using those data. Now, what is to be corrected in this regard? We know that there is diversity in Nigeria. That cannot change, or that will not change. And we know that there will always be political interest. These two are things that are not going to change tomorrow. But what do we do about it to limit or to reduce the rate at which people will need to manipulate results or try to interfere with the process because of what they will gain from it in terms of revenue allocation and economic development that will be drawn to their area?
You see, Blessing, I don't see that as a fear or worry at all. For some of us who are students of society, we have since graduated from ballot snatching to vote buying. Why do you think that happened? Because we have integrated technology into the electoral process. That snatching a ballot box does not equal to electoral victory. You see, technology solves this problem. It takes it naturally away, because if you have technology that's working real time, especially the use of biometrics in this data collection, what would a politician profit, for example, in trying to put a fingerprint that the system will reject? It will naturally reduce those human interference and political pressure. That's my honest view. Because in the 1979 election, I remember how many thumbprints that were done in the room and election is announced. But no, that's not possible with the BVAS technology, that before you have to vote, you have to be accredited. Your thumbprint has to show that you actually registered. And that's the area where I spoke to the hybrid, where people are making excuses for places where technology is not operating. You know, I was speaking to one of our friends, Professor Ford in Rwanda about 2 days ago, and he was asking me some basic question that even in Rwanda they have gone beyond some of all these issues, that a USSD code can solve a lot of problems without necessarily have to have internet access. And I think we must get into that point where going forward we're not just going to be relying on this enumeration, that even Nigerian Population Commission should be able to integrate into their system where people can remotely register and authenticate their identity on the system. And that will reduce cost in the longer run. So we need to invest in this process and see how we can ensure that technology remove all human interferences, and then we can have a very clean data that the nation can plan with.
So in a situation where there's a common poll or a common unit where people go to have their data captured, would it be as effective as when the enumerators go to their houses? Because then to be left to their discretion, except there's a penalty attached to it.
You see, it's just to put a little incentive into it. Take, for example, JAMB came with a process. If you don't have national identification, you can't register JAMB. Then forget it at your peril. It's either you want to go to university or you don't want to go to the university. If this become a precondition, for example, to enroll in a primary school, for example, people will naturally do it. So you just need to create the incentive, the right incentive, put it in place. People will work to go and capture data. Because if you don't have access to national resource, nobody will tell you to go and do it. If it becomes, for example, if you don't have your census number or your national ID card number, you cannot vote. In short, politicians will help those who don't have access to go and register because they need their vote. So put incentive around it. It may not necessarily have to be money. And this drives people to naturally submit to it. You see, because until we really have real-time data, our national discourse cannot start. Because this is where the problem is. You remember in 2006, after the census, national census, the figure between Lagos and Kano put Kano a little above Lagos. And Lagos State did their own internal census and came up with a new figure of over 20 million against the 15 million that was in Kano. You see, this creates a room for national suspicion because the data are not known. Now, what you do is that once you now have this adequate data, we will know where the population really is. We cannot determine and say, okay, for equity purpose, for the principle of proportionality, we can determine now where to put our resource and how to allocate this resource without offending any side of the subnationals in our federation.